Welcome to Insight Lens, the channel where we uncover the hidden forces shaping our world. Tonight, we explore Europe's green agenda and ask, is this truly about saving the planet or about securing dominance in the age of clean energy? October 2023 marked a turning point in Europe's climate agenda. The European Union launched the transitional phase of its Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, or CBAM. At first, it looks like a noble effort to fight climate change. Importers of steel, cement, aluminum, fertilizer, electricity, and hydrogen must now report the carbon embedded in their products. By 2026, those importers will need to buy CBAM certificates matching each ton of CO2 emissions not already taxed in their home country under a carbon price system. On paper, this is about protecting the planet, but from Washington's perspective, it is also about power. For centuries, Europe and the United States built their wealth on coal and oil without ever paying a carbon bill. Britain's coal production, for example, exploded from just a few million tons in the mid-18th century to more than 200 million tons by the early 20th century. That black fuel powered steam engines, railroads, steel mills, and the empire itself. Later, America's oil boom, crowned by John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil in 1870, turned the U.S. into the world's energy center. By the 1920s, American output topped 500 million barrels per year. During World War II, U.S. oil supplied the majority of Allied needs, giving Washington strategic leverage that helped shape the modern world. None of these powers were asked to declare emissions or pay a carbon tax when they were rising. Manchester's air was thick with smoke, Pittsburgh's skies turned black at noon, the Ruhr in Germany churned out steel under clouds of soot, yet no international law forced them to count the cost. Now, with their industries mature and their technology advanced, Europe has written a new rulebook, and that rulebook demands the rest of the world go green on Europe's terms. This is the paradox. The EU preaches climate justice, yet its CBAM risks functioning as a green trade barrier, one that shifts the cost of transition onto developing nations, while reinforcing Europe's own strategic advantage. From an American lens, the question is clear. Is this really about saving the planet, or about securing Europe's place in the new energy order? As the 20th century unfolded, fossil fuels became the bloodstream of Western power. Oil, more than coal, shaped the geopolitics of the modern era. And once again, Europe and the United States were at the center of it. In America, the oil boom turned into an industrial revolution of its own. By the 1920s, U.S. production exceeded 500 million barrels a year, giving Washington control of more than 60% of global output. That dominance wasn't just about wealth, it was about war. During World War II, American oil supplied the bulk of the Allied war machine. Without it, tanks would not have rolled, aircraft would not have flown, and the outcome of the conflict might have looked very different. Oil cemented America's rise as the arsenal of democracy. Across the Atlantic, Europe was equally transformed. Nations like Germany, France, and the Netherlands threw themselves into the oil age. Rotterdam became a critical hub, handling close to 100 million tons of crude annually by the late 20th century, and even more when refined products are counted. Europe's chemical industry, heavy manufacturing, and expanding transport networks all depended on cheap and abundant fossil energy. The results were undeniable. Steamships, automobiles, jet aircrafts, synthetic chemicals, and mass steel production, these were the engines that turned agrarian nations into global powers. By the mid-20th century, coal and oil had become more than just energy sources. They were instruments of empire, underwriting both colonial expansion and military supremacy. Yet through all this, no one was asked to pay for the carbon cost. There was no international tribunal demanding emission reports, no global standard taxing Europe's industrial smoke or America's gasoline engines. The world's leading economies built their prosperity on the unchecked burning of fossil fuels. And only now, once they have secured their technological lead, do they turn to climate rules as the next great standard of power. When we step back and measure the historical ledger of emissions, the imbalance is staggering. From 1750 to 2019, the United Kingdom alone released an estimated 78 billion tons of carbon dioxide, once enough to rank among the top 5 global emitters. But it is the United States that stands as the true giant of the fossil fuel era. Over the course of its industrial history, America has emitted more than 400 billion tons of CO2, roughly 1/4 of all human emissions ever recorded. Europe as a whole is not far behind. Centuries of coal-fired factories, steel mills, and oil refineries place the continent firmly among the top contributors to climate change. By contrast, Africa, home to more than 1.2 billion people, accounts for less than 3% of cumulative global emissions. South Asia, still struggling with poverty and late industrialization, has also contributed only a fraction compared to the transatlantic powers. This is the central paradox. The nations that built their wealth by burning the most carbon are now the same nations writing the rulebook for the green transition. In cities like Manchester, soot once blackened the skies for decades, without consequence. In the Ruhr, smokestacks define the skyline of Germany's steel furnace of Europe. In Pittsburgh, the American steel capital, skies turned so dark with coal dust that people used lamps at noon. None of it was taxed. None of it was regulated under any global framework. Today, however, Brussels tells exporters in India, Vietnam, or Turkey that unless their steel or cement meets Europe's climate standards, they must pay a carbon penalty at the border. The irony is hard to miss. For Washington, it raises an unavoidable question. If truly fairness matters, shouldn't those who emitted the most in the past carry the greatest share of responsibility today?
To understand Europe's new climate weapon, we need to look closely at how CBAM actually works. In October 2023, the EU launched its transitional phase. For now, importers of carbon-intensive goods, steel, cement, aluminum, fertilizer, electricity, and hydrogen must simply report the amount of CO2 embedded in their products. But this is only the rehearsal. Beginning in 2026, companies shipping into Europe will be required to buy CBAM certificates for every ton of emissions not already covered by a carbon price in their home country. The certificates are pegged to the price of carbon within the EU's emissions trading system, effectively forcing foreign producers to play by Brussels rules. On the surface, the logic sounds fair. Level the playing field so European companies paying for emissions are not undercut by cheaper imports from abroad. But from Washington, the picture looks more complicated. Europe is not just regulating its own market, it is exporting its climate law to the rest of the world. Countries like India or Vietnam that rely on coal-based steel production suddenly face costs they can barely absorb. Turkey, which supplies more than a third of Europe's cement imports, risks losing competitiveness entirely. The transitional phase is only the beginning. Brussels has already signaled that CBAM may expand to cover other sectors such as chemicals, polymers, and even textiles. For developing nations, that would mean an ever-widening barrier around the European market. And for the United States, it sets a precedent. Europe is using environmental policy as a trade instrument, something America cannot ignore. So while Brussels frames CBAM as climate justice, Washington sees it as climate geopolitics. The mechanism is less about cutting global emissions and more about who controls the terms of the green economy.
The first victims of Europe's carbon border are the world's emerging economies. In India, the steel industry warns that CBAM could drive prices up by more than a third. Indian production still depends heavily on coal-fired blast furnaces, which means every ton of exported steel carries a heavy carbon footprint. If Brussels enforces CBAM strictly, that cost will be passed directly onto Indian exporters, eroding their competitiveness in Europe's lucrative market. Turkey faces a similar challenge. Cement is one of the country's strongest exports to the EU, accounting for more than a third of Europe's total imports. But cement production is among the most carbon-intensive industries in the world. Meeting EU standards would require billions of dollars in carbon capture and storage investments, technology that most Turkish firms cannot afford. Without it, CBAM will raise their costs and shrink their market share. And then there is Vietnam. Each year, Vietnamese steel exports to Europe are valued at around $2.5 billion, but the country relies on coke-fired blast furnaces, one of the dirtiest methods of steelmaking. If CBAM is fully enforced, the added carbon charges could push prices up to 20 to 30%, making Vietnamese steel far less attractive to European buyers. Cement, another major Vietnamese export, is also at risk. To comply with EU rules, producers would need carbon capture systems costing billions, well beyond the reach of most firms. This is the reality for much of the developing world. Nations that never benefited from centuries of cheap coal and oil are now asked to pay the price of decarbonization. For Washington, the imbalance is obvious. Europe reaped the gains of fossil-fueled growth without constraint, but now it is placing the burden of transition on those still climbing the development ladder.
At the heart of this debate lies a simple but uncomfortable truth. Not all nations share the same responsibility for climate change. The United States and Europe together account for nearly half of all historical carbon emissions. These were the engines of the Industrial Revolution, the superpowers of the fossil age. By contrast, entire continents like Africa have contributed less than 3% of the total. Yet today, every country is being told to meet the same green standards. This is where the charge of double standards becomes unavoidable. If fairness truly mattered, the countries that emitted the most in the past would be expected to carry the heaviest burden in financing the transition through technology transfer, climate finance, and shared risk. In theory, this principle was recognized in international agreements. In practice, it has been ignored. At the 2015 Paris Climate Summit, developed nations pledged $100 billion annually to help poor countries adapt and decarbonize. Nearly a decade later, those funds remain underdelivered, trickling out slowly, often tied to projects managed by Western contractors. Meanwhile, mechanisms like CBAM move quickly, imposing strict costs on exporters from India, Turkey, and Vietnam. From Washington's perspective, this contradiction is clear. Europe preaches climate justice, but practices climate protectionism. For America, the question is not whether a green transition is necessary. It is. The question is who gets to define what green means and who pays the steepest price for getting there.
While Europe builds walls, America has chosen a different path. In March 2024, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency finalized the toughest vehicle emission standards in history, but with an important adjustment. The Biden administration eased its initial timeline, allowing gasoline cars and hybrids to remain on the market longer. The reasoning was clear. The transition to electric vehicles is inevitable, but forcing it too fast could disrupt industries, limit consumer choice, and spark political backlash. Instead of carbon tariffs, Washington is betting on incentives. The Inflation Reduction Act of 2022 commits roughly $369 billion to clean energy and climate programs. It offers tax credits for solar panels, wind farms, battery plants, hydrogen hubs, and electric vehicles assembled in North America. Rather than punishing imports with new walls, the U.S. strategy is to stimulate domestic innovation and manufacturing capacity. This does not mean America is ignoring fossil fuels. Oil and natural gas remain central to the U.S. economy, and gasoline cars will continue to dominate the roads for years. But the shift is gradual, built on investment rather than punishment. From Washington's perspective, Europe's CBAM looks like coercion, forcing developing nations to pay for a transition they can barely afford. America's approach, by contrast, is designed to balance climate goals with economic pragmatism and political reality. In short, while Brussels writes rules for others, Washington is keeping its options open, pursuing green energy as a field of competition and innovation, not simply as a weapon of control. If technology is one pillar of the green transition, capital is the other. And here, the scale of the challenge is almost unimaginable. Analysts at Bloomberg NEF estimate that reaching global net zero by 2050 could require investments in the order of hundreds of trillions of dollars, more than 200 trillion spread across grids, renewables, storage, and infrastructure. Even building the power grids alone may cost more than $20 trillion over the next 3 decades. For wealthy nations, these are staggering sums, but still manageable. For poorer economies, they are nearly impossible. Many African countries already spend more than 10% of their annual revenues servicing debt. In Nigeria, that figure has reached almost 80% in recent years. With so much of their budgets tied up in debt payments, how can they possibly finance solar farms, wind projects, or carbon capture facilities on the scale Europe demands? This is where promises and reality diverge. At Paris in 2015, developed nations pledged $100 billion annually in climate finance. Nearly a decade later, those funds remain short of target. What money is delivered often flows back to Western contractors and financial institutions, leaving little real capacity in the recipient countries. From Washington's perspective, this imbalance is unsustainable. If the world is to decarbonize fairly, capital cannot remain locked in the global north while the global south shoulders impossible costs. Otherwise, the green transition risks becoming another cycle of dependency, one where developing nations borrow under conditions set by Europe only to spend that money on European technology and expertise.
Technology has always defined power. In the fossil fuel age, whoever mastered drilling, refining, and combustion engines commanded global influence. In the green age, the same principle applies, only now the battleground is wind turbines, solar panels, batteries, and hydrogen. Today, the balance of technology is heavily tilted towards the developed world. According to the International Renewable Energy Agency, more than 80% of patents and advanced manufacturing processes in renewable energy are concentrated in the G7. Germany and Denmark dominate offshore wind turbine design. The United States and Japan control much of the intellectual property behind advanced battery chemistry and wafer production. But there is one outlier: China. Over the past 2 decades, Beijing has captured over 75% of global solar panel manufacturing and controls more than 95% of wafer production, the critical heart of the photovoltaic supply chain. On paper, this makes China the world's solar superpower. Yet even China remains dependent on certain Western technologies and specialized equipment, a reminder that control over core tech is rarely absolute. For emerging economies in South Asia, Africa, or Latin America, the dependence is even sharper. Many have ideal conditions for solar and wind, but without access to advanced manufacturing, they must import most of the equipment. In India, for instance, over 70% of solar components are still imported, largely from China and Europe. In Kenya, the Lake Turkana wind farm became the continent's largest project, but 80% of its parts had to be shipped in from abroad. From Washington's perspective, this concentration of technology is more than a market fact. It is a lever of power. Whoever owns the patents, designs, and supply chains will shape the rules of the green economy. And in this race, both Europe and China are positioning themselves not just as innovators, but as gatekeepers of the world's energy future.
When we peel back the layers of the green transition, the pattern becomes clear. This is not just about replacing coal with solar or oil with wind. It is about rewriting the architecture of global power. In the past, empires were built on coal mines, oil wells, and steel mills. Today, they are being built on carbon standards, patents, and control over critical minerals like lithium, cobalt, and nickel. For Europe, CBAM is not merely an environmental policy. It is a geopolitical tool. By forcing others to adopt its rules, Brussels ensures that the EU remains the referee of global trade in a decarbonized era. For China, the dominance of solar manufacturing is not just industrial policy, it is strategic leverage. And for the United States, the Inflation Reduction Act signals a bet that innovation, rather than regulation, will secure leadership in the clean economy. This is the new battlefield. Standards instead of soldiers, regulations instead of rifles, a war not fought with bullets but with definitions of what counts as green and who gets to decide. It is a quieter struggle, but no less decisive. From Washington's vantage point, the challenge is twofold: to accelerate America's own clean energy transformation while ensuring that Europe's green protectionism and China's industrial dominance do not leave the United States and its allies locked into someone else's rulebook. The age of fossil fuel empires is ending. The age of green empires has already begun. And once again, the real question is not only who will save the planet, but who will rule it.
Thank you for watching Insight Lens. If you found this analysis eye-opening, don't forget to subscribe and join us for the next deep dive into the forces shaping our future. See you in the next video.